Some of the most famous writers in the 20th century were also some of the most famous drinkers. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, who famously said, or didn't say, "Write drunk, edit sober." Like William Faulkner, who in a Paris Review interview said, "In my own experience, the tools of my trade most necessary are paper, tobacco, food, and a little whiskey." Writers like Dorothy Parker, who once said, "I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." Writers like Raymond Chandler, Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, Raymond Carver, Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Bukowski, and many, many more. When I was a young writer, I totally idolized those people. I would always go to write in a bar. This was back before COVID, before writing in a bar was kind of a perilous task. And I would go to write in a bar, I'd find a nice quiet bar. I would sip a gin and ginger ale, which I thought was very unique, and I would work on my second novel. But I have to ask myself, was I actually more creative? Was I actually more inspired? Was the writing better than what I produce when sober? Hemingway, after all, when someone asked him, "Hey, how many martinis do you drink when you write?" responded, "Jesus Christ, have you ever heard of anyone who drank while he wrote? You're thinking of Faulkner." But even if Hemingway did drink a lot, but he didn't drink while writing, that myth, that idea that if you drink when you write, you might be more creative is very pervasive. But also because the myth of Hemingway's drinking has far surpassed the reality. And generations of young writers have followed in his stumbling footsteps. Hemingway's relationship to alcohol went beyond a physical compulsion, but instead had a spiritual component. He compared sitting at a bar to going to church. Many writers, including myself, have romanticized booze as the ideal muse, the substance that might bring us into a rapturous, creative frenzy, unburdened by our sober, overly critical selves. There's also some anecdotal evidence, according to the book Alcohol and the Writer by Donald W. Goodwin. Writers are more likely to die of cirrhosis of the liver, which is the disease closely associated with alcohol abuse, than other occupations. Now let's ask the real question, which is, well, when you drink, are you more creative? And the answer is, well, it depends how much you drink. We have this idea, alcohol helps loosen your inhibitions. It makes you more social. And so I think we often think of alcohol as something that lubricates us, that makes us more loose. And so we have more cognitive jumps from one idea to another. Very little or no research has been done on an actual population of writers, but in 2012, a study was published that focused on the relationship between being slightly inebriated and creative problem solving. Basically, they gave a bunch of people who were sober and drunk some creative problem solving puzzles, and it turns out that the people who were a little bit inebriated could do them better than the sober people. And the reason that they gave was it keeps you in a weird way distracted, so you are more distractible when you are drunk. Therefore, your mind is willing to make bigger and bigger jumps. You're very bad at logic problems like plotting or spelling or writing good sentences, but you are technically better at creative problem solving. Of course, there's two huge caveats to this. As soon as you have more than 2 or 3 drinks, as soon as you are more than 0.07% alcohol content in your body, that better creativity totally goes out the window. And also, even moderate drinking over a long period of time has a negative cumulative effect on your brain. So the more that you drink, the more your brain gets washed in alcohol, and it kind of works worse and worse. And I think most importantly, alcohol affects your working memory. It affects how much memory you can actually access, which, if you're a writer, it's very important to remember precise details. I think precise details are what makes up good fiction and poetry. So if you're writing drunk, you might be missing out on those other skills that you need as a storyteller. We use alcohol to silence our inner critics, our anxiety that this thing that we're writing might not be good, and instead we can kind of indulge in a wild Dionysian abandon of creativity. Or maybe we're drinking while we write to cope with the feelings, the emotional turmoil that boils up when we write something that is truly close to our hearts. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to justify drinking and writing. I'm also not trying to condemn it. I do it myself, but I just think it's curious where these ideas even come from. First, let's go all the way back to the prehistoric era. We know about cave paintings, and it is believed that cave paintings were often the result of early humans or even former species before the Homo sapien who were using psychedelic substances to enlighten themselves and then were inspired to depict what they saw or what they experienced. Okay, now let's be forward in time to ancient Greece, where I think it's interesting to think about art as not just an individualistic expression, but also a part of society and culture. So very famously, the Greeks had a god of wine named Dionysus. And Dionysus loved stories. He loved poetry. He was not the god of poetry. That was Apollo, god of poetry and music. But it was still very common to recite stories and poetry at a Dionysian festival, festivals that were typically steeped in wine. It might be notable that the Greeks gave us the word muse in their mythology, which we still use today to talk about kind of an inspiration from an external force, which I think a lot of people believe that they can access through the use of substances. Excess consumption to access creativity is not a new concept, and it's also not gone away. It's just changed. You know, we use wine, we might use psychedelic substances, we might be like in the romantic era where they're accessing nature and the soul, and of course a lot of laudanum and opium. We know that alcohol is not the only substance that writers use in order to access creativity. One of those writers I find personally really interesting is Louisa May Alcott. She wrote the book Little Women. She was quite famously part of the Prohibition movement to outlaw alcohol. However, when she wrote, as well as when she was not writing, she very commonly indulged in laudanum. Of course, that's quite a depressive. On the other hand, you have a writer like Stephen King, who really enjoyed Coca-Cola and admitted to doing a lot of Coca-Cola while he was writing his hit novel Cujo about a rabid dog. And since then, he's actually stopped drinking and also stopped indulging in all sorts of other substances. And one of the most famous writers is, of course, Hunter S. Thompson, the so-called father of gonzo journalism, who had a schedule of consumption for Coca-Cola, acid, copious amounts of alcohol, I mean like stupidly a lot amount of Coca-Cola, as well as a lot of other substances. We've been talking about how writers use alcohol and other substances to help themselves access creativity. We've talked about the science, we've talked about the history, and we've also talked about some more contemporary examples, but I want to end with my own experience. For the longest time, pretty much since I was 16, I have used different substances to write. In fact, there is definitely like podcast interviews out in the world where I talk very openly about what I did and how I did it. And I don't know how I feel about that. I think that it's actually a very unhealthy thing to tie productivity and creativity to substance consumption, I'll say. Because what I think ends up happening, and what definitely happened to me, especially when I was young, when I was writing my first novel, I got very into pills. I don't really want to say what kind of pills, but ones that were very powerful and very dangerous and could lead to a lot of other stuff. And I did them for probably about 5 years of my life, starting in high school and all the way through college. It is what I used while writing my first novel, as well as writing a lot of other bad novels. And it's, you know, I think you get to this point where you write something brilliant while you are under the influence, and you start to believe that if you ever want to access that brilliance again, if you ever want to be a true creative, if you ever want to connect with that ethereal thing that we're all searching for, then you have to use what you use. You have to drink. You have to use that substance so that you can access that higher plane of creativity. And these days, I you know, I still write drunk sometimes. I don't write well drunk. Sometimes I'll say, hey, I'm gonna write drunk tonight, and then I just end up getting drunk. I'm not writing at all. And I guess I just want to caution people that if you are experimenting with these things, if you're using these things, that they use them as a tool and you don't let those things use you, that you don't allow yourself to believe that you are nothing without that substance, that you are not inherently yourself creative or worthy of accessing something crucial to say.